Hey guys, it's Jackson. Continuing on what Rob said about OPEC being a trade bloc, being involved in a trade bloc, OPEC also acts as a cartel, even though cartels usually get negative connotation as drug trafficking and drug trade in South America and Mexico and coming into the United States. But we're actually talking about how just organizations can be cartels if they are trying to regulate supply in order to maintain high prices. And OPEC actually does this with their oil production. So they'll try to produce less in order to drive up price or restrict competition in order to maintain a high price in oil. So the next slide, we'll talk about how OPEC actually can cause some of these oil shortages, and so they actually um, had an embargo against the United States in 1973, which was known as the Oil War after in the aftermath, and it just kind of they stopped selling oil or exporting oil to the United States, which inherently drove up prices for the United States, and there was no supply, and so they were forced to use their own supply in oil, and it really put a damper on the U.S. economy. And I'll show in the next slide how there was a recession for a couple of years because of the shortage and how it really affected the economy. As you can see in the pictures below, the gas shortage, they were limiting customers to how much gas they could take out and how much gas they could use to fill up their cars. And they actually made a couple legal changes. They dropped the speed limit so that people would, they use less gas in order to get from point A to point B, and so they're not revving their motors up and down the highway and stuff like that, so that they can reduce their output in oil and use less. And so here's that graph I was talking about. You can see in the early 1970s, those gray bars are actually points where there's a recession, and you can see the blue line there is actually the price of oil. So you can see it was in the low 20s in the early 1970s, and it jumped during that export embargo to about $60. So you can see it almost tripled there, and that put a huge damper on the U.S. economy. And so OPEC actually has a couple countries that it talks to and has some alliance with, and they want to control prices with them because they're also some oil exporting countries. So these include Bahrain, Azerbaijan, Brunei, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Mexico, Oman, South Sudan, and Sudan. And Russia is actually the main leader of OPEC Plus. And these 10 additional countries, um, they kind of aim to fix the global crude oil prices. And so they're teaming up with OPEC, but they don't have like the requirements to be in OPEC, or they don't want to pay the fee to be in OPEC, um, or else they would be in OPEC. Um, Another reason you don't want to be, or maybe you wouldn't want to be in OPEC, is that you have to kind of play by their rules. So I think Russia, that's one of the reasons why they're not in OPEC. Technical difficulties there. So we'll continue by talking about how OPEC can be compared to other large countries in the world who are producing oil. So OPEC actually produces 44% of the world's total oil output per day, but they can boast of 81.5% of the world's total oil reserves that they have on hold. So they have a large supply that they just kind of have on hold in case anything goes wrong, like this current COVID crisis is causing with the oversupply in oil. So in 2019, this graph only goes till 2018, but in 2019, the United States produced about 15 million barrels per day, and so there you can see their dark blue chart, or their dark blue line, steadily or greatly increasing every year after 2012 there, to catch up to Saudi Arabia, who's an OPEC country, and Russia, who's a big competitor in the oil production. And so you can also see that Saudi Arabia in 2019 was at about 12 million barrels per day, and Russia was at 10.8 million barrels per day, which is the largest three in the world today. And I think the next one is an OPEC country. I think it's Iran, who's at about 5 million barrels per day. And so OPEC today has a very low demand for their production of oil because of COVID-19, and a lot of the problems are due to less transportation, and people are kind of staying at home and working from home, so there's less use of public transportation that has a large demand for oil, and people aren't driving their cars around as much as they did 3 months ago, which has taken a big hit on the oil market today. And so on March 5th, 2020, OPEC gathered and decided to cut production of oil in order to keep a high price for their oil because of the falling demand. They wanted to keep supply low, and so OPEC was encouraging Russia to do the same, as well as the other OPEC plus countries. But Russia declined their suggestion to cut production because they kind of wanted to do their own thing, and they were like, "Hey, we're not going to cut our supply. We're going to keep producing the same. Like, we don't think the prices are going to be as affected as much as you think." But so the prices actually dropped a bunch, and it caused a huge problem among the OPEC countries. And they actually just struck a deal today, actually on April 12th, 2020, that includes the U.S. and it basically says that all OPEC countries and OPEC plus countries, including the United States, are going to have to cut oil production. And so I talked about how in 2019 the U.S. produced 15 million barrels of oil per day, and now they're cutting back. And in 2020, I think they're going to cut production back to 11.8 million barrels per day, which is a big chunk. And it's all due to these falling demand in oil, and they're trying to cut the supply in order to keep that oil price at bay and keep it up as high as they can. So thank you for listening to our presentation, and I hope you find it very informative.